At the dawn of the Cold War in 1944, a government was born that would mark a milestone in the history of the 20th century. The protagonist of this unprecedented period in Guatemala was Juan Jacobo Arbenz. His life was entirely dedicated to his nation, a country that at the time of his birth was still that typical tropical nation, decimated by disease and by poverty, where the ruins of ancient civilizations that had once prospered contrasted greatly with the state in which present-day Guatemala found itself. Jacobo Arbenz pushed forward an unprecedented agrarian reform that was about to transform the economic and social life of the country, raising the status of the peasant as a worker and now as a new landowner. Jacobo Arbenz's aspirations for the suffering Guatemalan people were very high, so much so that they disrupted American interest and their monopolies, so much so that they reached the dining rooms of Guatemalan high society, and so much so that it made the fruits harvested in Guatemalan lands bitter by the controversial United Fruit Company. Jacobo Arbenz is not someone you love or hate, but rather someone you remember or don't know about. The governments that claim to be Guatemalan have worked hard to erase his footprint and his legacy. Today we are going to learn about the life and work of the man who envisioned a Guatemala that would be the master of its own destiny, a dream that would cost him a bitter ending. Juan Jacobo Arbenz Guzman was born on September 14, 1913 in Quetzaltenango, a tropical city in the south of Guatemala. His appearance and personal image showed prominent European features. His father, Hans Jacob Arbenz Groebli, was a native of Switzerland and had traveled to Guatemala in 1899 to work. With his uncle, who in turn worked in some German businesses in the area, Jacobo Arbenz's father managed to establish a pharmacy and dedicated himself to selling products brought from Germany and Europe. On the other hand, his mother, Octavia Guzman Caballeros, was a teacher, a middle-class woman with refined Guatemalan traditions. The books say that both parents had a reserved and calm character. Doña Octavia teaches young Jacobo his first letters, teaching him to read and write and passing on the Catholic religion to him. Meanwhile, Hans Jacob was not very interested in his son learning German or being Protestant like him. For much of his childhood, Jacobo Arbenz and his family lived comfortably thanks to the many businesses his father managed. However, the 1929 United States financial crash, which greatly affected Central America, significantly reduced the purchasing power of the Arbenz-Guzman couple. In view of this, Jacobo Arbenz's family moved to a farm that Hans Jacob was entrusted to manage. It was on that farm where the young Jacobo Arbenz had a deep contact with the rural reality of the time, seeing their hardships and struggles up close. So, even though his father was the administrator and Jacobo Arbenz seemed more like the son of the owners of the farm, this pastime with the peasants connects him to them and makes him sympathetic to their cause. Before and during this period of financial hardship, Jacobo Arbenz was able to enjoy a relatively peaceful childhood. He had a small group of friends with whom he played in the streets and practiced sports like soccer, wrestling, boxing, polo, and horseback riding. Estudió at the Colegio de María de Benet de Rols and the Instituto Nacional para Varones de Occidente. He always stood out for his intelligence, love for studying, and reading. His character was unique, serious but endearing, introverted and extroverted at the same time. Reserved, secretive, helpful, and courteous, he was a chivalrous and handsome young man. Jacobo Arbenz finished high school, and even though his dream was to study economics or engineering, the military field was not his preference at all. Because of financial hardship, he ended up accepting a scholarship to study at the Polytechnic School, where the future soldiers of the Guatemalan army were trained, entering there in Ioatzicanati, 1932. Once at the Polytechnic School, a 19-year-old Jacobo realized that the military field was indeed to his liking. And from then on, he always tried to excel in all the subjects and duties he had at the school. This earned him many distinctions and decorations throughout his career as a sergeant, second sergeant, first sergeant, standard bearer, and captain of the cadet company. He was disciplined, studious, and regularly prided himself on learning everything he could. At school, he also stood out for defending the new cadets from the abuses of the veterans. In addition, his build, skills, and energy earned him recognition. Because of his performance in sports he had practiced since childhood, such as boxing, becoming the undisputed school champion in this sport, polo, and many others like motorcycling. Finally, shortly after suffering a severe injury that almost cost him his leg, Arbenz graduates in December. From 1935 at the age of 22, with all honors as a military officer of the nation of Guatemala until 1938. Although he almost never went to parties at a celebration, Jacobo, Arbenz meets a young woman of 23 years old named Maria Cristina Villanova. Originally from the high society of neighboring El Salvador, she was similar to the aristocratic young ladies of her time. However, she received a basic education at high-quality private schools. And although she was denied the opportunity to pursue university studies, she was able to educate herself in various fields of knowledge. When she met Arbenz, Miss Villanova fell madly in love. She found in him her soulmate. That's something she was missing to satisfy not only her intellectual desires, but also to fill that emptiness of love that arose when she saw the young man, Cabo. Arbenz, for his part, also feels struck by that Salvadoran young lady, and moved as well by an intellectual and youthful love-longing, decides to go out with Maria Cristina. Maria Cristina recalls in her memoirs that she and her young companion used to stroll through historic Guatemala city center, discussing diverse topics like physics, chemistry, history, and literature, about the main problems faced by workers, about the political issues in Guatemala, and many other topics. They kept seeing each other until March 14, 1939. Despite opposition from the bride's parents, Jacobo and Maria Cristina get married in a simple ceremony at the Chapel of the Tabernacle in the Metropolitan Cathedral. At that time, Arbenz was a second lieutenant of infantry and a professor of military logistics and history at the Polytechnic School, so he earned a very modest income. Maria Cristina was at odds with her family because of her decision to marry the humble Jacobo. Therefore, the two of them had to build a home from scratch, first living in a rather humble house. Thanks to Jacobo and Maria Cristina's efforts, they significantly improved their financial situation. The Arbenz-Villanova couple also had 3 children, Arabella, Leonora, and Jacobo. From the beginning of his military career, Jacobo Arbenz not only showed remarkable intelligence and leadership skills, but also began building connections. He became interested in government affairs and gained very good contacts within the army and the political class. At the Polytechnic School, both as a student and as a teacher, he met many military men who would later join him in an action that would mark his life, and that of Guatemala, the famous coup d'etat of 1944. But to understand that coup, we need to refer to the reality of Guatemala and its background. Is there a social and agrarian problem in Guatemala that can be traced back to colonial times? At that time, Indians, mestizos, and Spaniards, whether Creoles or Peninsulares, lived in a deeply divided society. The Spaniards, owners of the land and of a magnificent agricultural production system inherited from the Mayan civilization, maintained a semi-feudal or peonage system where the peasant lived under very precarious conditions. The independence of Guatemala in 1821 didn't change this much, and in 1871, when the so-called liberal reform took place, the first industrial plants in the country were opened and the traditional Guatemalan oligarchy merged with the new bourgeoisie arriving from abroad. Sometime later, under this same reality, in 1931, President Jorge Ubico came to power in Guatemala, and he would govern until 1944. Ubico maintained a policy of centralizing power. He set out to limit the excessive power of the landowners, to vindicate the peasants, and to turn Guatemala into a modern capitalist country. He modernized the armed forces with help from the United States and increased the country's road network fivefold. He modernized the armed forces with help from the United States and increased the country's road network fivefold, favoring the monopoly over the roads, held by the United Fruit Company. It's essential to understand American history by knowing what the United Fruit Company was. An American multinational company dedicated to tropical fruits, which quickly became a huge monopoly in Latin America. It became an actor that intervened in the politics of those Hispanic American countries, sponsoring coup d'etat, massacres of peasants, financing political parties, and responding to any attempt in those countries to diversify their monopolistic market or to improve the terrible working conditions of its workers. All of this was also part of the United States imperial policy, in which the United States had assumed the role of the great economic and political leader of the American hemisphere. This had led since the 19th century to more than a dozen direct or indirect interventions by this power just in Central American countries. Going back to the Ubico government, his policies made the landowners see their authority as owners and heirs of the least cultivated land. Meanwhile, the peasants began to feel increasingly empowered. At the same time, in the newly emerged middle class, groups began to protest for a democratic system and not a dictatorship. These middle-class sectors gained support from landowners and bourgeois dissatisfied with Ubico. For their part, for years, young military officers had been gathering around Jacobo Arbenz, as well as other prominent officers, dissatisfied with the situation and eager for a change in leadership. All these elements, Ubico's reformist measures and their reactions, were creating a situation of political conflict. After a month of continuous protests and pressure, on July 1, 1944, President Jorge Ubico resigned from his position. The president handed over power to a governing junta, but Arbenz and his fellow military officers entered the scene. This junta, which intended to continue Ubico's system, was quickly overthrown by a coup led by Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, Jorge Torriello Garrido, and Francisco Javier Arana. The 73 years of the old liberal reform came to an end, and a new era was beginning for Guatemala. Young military men like Arana and Arbenz now controlled the country. The movement of this group of military men has been called popular militarism, with affinities to the left, but without directly falling into it. Arbenz was particularly popular among the young cadets for having been a professor at the Polytechnic School. After the coup, a triumvirate was formed consisting of Arbenz, Arana, and Torriello Garrido. They wasted no time and got to work to enact new measures, repealed the current constitution, and called for presidential elections in December of the same year. 44, and in these he was elected by an overwhelming 85%. Don Juan José Arevalo Bermejo, who was the preferred candidate for several sectors of the country, including industrialists and farmers. At the same time, a new constitution was established with a distinctly progressive approach, which set the separation of the three branches of government: alternation in power, popular elections, mandatory and secret voting for literate people, and mandatory and public voting for illiterate people. No re-election, municipal, university, and judicial independence, participation of political parties without ideological restrictions, women's citizenship, and the creation of the National Literacy Committee. The law against land usurpation by large landowners, the Labor Code, support for agricultural and indigenous cooperatives, and other transformative measures for the time. Finally, the elected president, Arevalo, takes office on March 15, 1945. The triumvirate of the junta dissolves itself and paves the way for the democratization of the country. Watched over by the uniformed hands of the army, Jacobo Arbenz would become part of President Arevalo's cabinet as Minister of Defense. It was his first time holding a position of such magnitude, with great responsibility in his hands. For his part, President Juan José Arevalo would continue the process started a year earlier of decentralizing political power and democratizing the state after 14 years of Ubico's dictatorship. Congress is elected for the first time through popular elections, and greater autonomy is granted to the ministers, who are also under the supervision of Congress. But more than politics, the great drama of Guatemala was the situation of its workers and peasants. For this reason, on May 1, 1947, the Labor Code was approved. Its significance lay in a widespread change in the conditions of the workers. Working hours were regulated, wages and hiring were standardized, minimum working conditions and vacations for workers were mandated, and the formation of unions was encouraged. The so-called popular militarism of Jacobo Arbenz and his colleagues was nationalist in nature. It sought to strengthen the Guatemalan economy, but above all, to elevate the dignity of workers and peasants. This labor code sparked a long web of passions among the main actors on the Guatemalan political scene. The United Fruit Company, backed by the United States and with the help of the National Agriculture Association and the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, They requested a review of the code, considering it discriminatory against the business sector. On the other hand, several professionals and workers' groups also considered the code discriminatory, but in this case against peasants and workers. President Arevalo ends up taking the side of the workers and accepting several of their demands, while the demands of the United Fruit Company and the business sector were left in limbo. This progressive orientation in favor of the workers, maintained by both President Arevalo's government and the upcoming government of Arbenz, began to create resentment among the leading business groups, both national and foreign, including a powerhouse in itself like the United Fruit Company. That made the United States at that time pay special attention to its interests in Guatemala and start pulling more strings in that country. Going back to the labor code, at the end of the 1940s, the then Minister Arbenz had a nationalist vision about it. It was Minister Arbenz who led many meetings with the American Embassy and the United Fruit Company to resolve the disagreements in the process of negotiating the law. In the end, nothing was achieved, but Arbenz's nationalist tendency was demonstrated. Both Arbenz and his colleagues had set out to dismantle the monopoly of the United Fruit Company, which in their view was the cause of many of Guatemala's problems. In this struggle over the labor code and amid peasant protests, the government stripped the fruit company of its constitutional guarantees, so that the state could intervene in its lands in order to resolve the conflict. In response to these measures, the United Fruit Company, industrialists, large landowners, and members of high society decided to finance and form the party. The National Electoral Union in Guatemala, together with the General Association of Farmers and the Chamber of Commerce, openly promote a policy of hatred and violence against the government. Proof of this was the incident in July 1949 when General Arana, head of the armed forces, and the same man who had been part of the 1944 triumvirate with Arbenz, aligns himself with the interests of United States business and threatens to overthrow the president, Arevalo, if he didn't remove Arbenz from the Ministry of Defense, and if he didn't change his cabinet for people that he would appoint. Shortly after, Arana informs the president that the coup is underway, but Arbenz sends a military unit to arrest Arana and counter the coup. When Arbenz's units arrive, Arana and his entourage start a shootout, in which Arana is killed. Thus, the coup attempt sponsored by prominent economic groups from Guatemala and the United States was dismantled. But Arbenz understands that this conflict was far from over. As Arevalo's presidential term came to an end in that heavy atmosphere of political violence and struggle for interests, a new path would open. Jacobo Arbenz, who, backed by his own reputation as an honest man within the army and supported by the National Renovation and Revolutionary Action parties, runs for president and wins the 1950 elections. Jacobo Arbenz begins his term with a clear goal: to transform the Guatemalan economy from a semi-colonial dependent one to a modern and independent capitalist system. In the face of the growing violence caused by the opposition and foreign threats, Arbenz clearly sees the need to centralize power and to mobilize the peasantry and the working class into a sort of corporatist state. In that sense, his first change was to replace the 22 department governors and several cabinet positions with military officers he fully trusted. Based on previous experiences with United States policies towards Central America and the policies against the United Fruit Company, since 1950, Arbenz viewed a possible United States military intervention as a dangerous threat, especially since it was also supported by Guatemalan politicians allied with the North. The policies in favor of the peasants and workers were on the right track. However, Arbenz believed that more significant measures were necessary to truly guarantee a real improvement for the lower classes. This led him to promote what would become one of the most significant and controversial agrarian reforms of the 20th century, which we will tell you about shortly. During Arbenz's presidency, personalities from different backgrounds, including leaders of the Communist Party, had a notable presence in the government. This earned his government a reputation for being leftist and communist, although the facts showed otherwise. It was a time when people were accused of being communist as a pretext to persecute anyone who went against the geopolitical interests of the United States, whether or not that person was actually a communist. Jacobo Arbenz cared little about those labels since it was clear that his government, as the facts prove, was not communist but nationalist, that advocated for a revolution benefiting the Guatemalan people. And Jacobo Arbenz understood very well that acting in favor of the Guatemalan peasantry was not a communist act, but one of common sense and necessity. This pragmatic vision gave rise to the great work of Jacobo Arbenz's government, the Agrarian Reform. This agrarian reform became the main historical banner of the movement represented by Arbenz, and its purpose was to transform the countryside from a quasi-feudal situation, with a great concentration of land in a few hands, toward a system of capitalist peasant production in which the peasants would receive a fair reward, being both workers and owners at the same time. The reform aimed to distribute the idle and uncultivated lands, which were quite a few, among tens of thousands of peasants who could work them, because the goal was not only to improve their living conditions, but also to make the Guatemalan people a society of owners. After 2 months of discussion in Congress on June 17, 1952, the Agrarian Reform Law was approved. It was achieved after fruitless talks with the oligarchy, the landowners, and the business sector, who wanted to change every point of the proposal. The law originated from the mind of Jacobo Arbenz and was worked on and modified by various individuals, among whom there were declared communists. This was one of the arguments that gave the law and the government an unfounded image of wanting to establish Soviet-style communism in Guatemala. Although it did not correspond to reality, this propaganda was fiercely defended by the sectors that were disadvantaged by the law. Arbenz explained that meanwhile, the landowning proprietors lived in the cities without risks, content with visiting their estates from time to time and traveling around Europe. The peasant had no salary and knew nothing, was poorly dressed, walked barefoot, couldn't count beyond 1,000, and could barely write his name. Because of the historical significance of this law, it's good for us to know exactly what it proposed. Its stipulations were that all idle lands in private hands larger than 672 acres would be expropriated. All idle lands between 224 and 672 acres would be expropriated. Only if less than 2/3 were being cultivated. Lands smaller than 224 acres would not be affected by the law. State lands, also called national estates, whose size could vary, would be completely divided and distributed among several owners, many of them peasants. Idle lands expropriated from private hands would be granted to new owners as private property or lifetime tenure, depending on the preference of the beneficiary. For 25 years, each beneficiary would have to pay the government 3% annually of the income if he had the land in lifetime tenure, and 5% annually if he had the land as private property. In turn, the previous owners of the expropriated lands would be compensated with 3% in agrarian bonds for 25 years. The agrarian reform would be managed by departments at all levels, including local agrarian committees responsible for administering villages, towns, and plantations within their municipalities. Understanding that the reform had not only economic but also political implications, the government began to implement it quickly. The massive formation of thousands of agrarian committees begins, and the lands are being studied. In 2 years, more than 1,300,000 acres of idle land were expropriated, and more than 70,000 plots were distributed to over 130,000 peasant families. In addition, the government provides advice and technical assistance to the peasants. On its part, the monopoly, the United Fruit Company, had about 550,000 acres of uncultivated land. Arbenz himself, tired of the abuse and empty promises from the fruit company, expropriated about 386,000 idle acres from them. More than $8 billion are paid in compensation bonds to the owners of these expropriated lands. Arbenz claimed that this was the work of dignity for the Guatemalan peasants who had accompanied him for so many years. From his childhood days in Quetzaltenango to his most recent visits to the fields he had arrived, Arbenz himself, who owned some land, agreed to lose about 1.667 acres of his cotton farm in accordance with what was established by the law. Just like him, there were many men in the government who agreed to give up their land for the proper fulfillment of the reform, and the results are the best indicator of a policy. In addition to the tens of thousands of peasants who became owners of small plots of land with proper guidance and joining cooperatives, the first year of the reform saw a significant increase in the production of almost all crops. Over 2 years, corn, bean, and rice production and exports rose. Initially, a production decrease was expected due to the radical ongoing changes. This unprecedented agrarian reform in the region was causing a lot of talk across the continent. All thanks to Jacobo Arbenz, whom the country began to nickname the soldier of the people and the colonel of the spring. But Arbenz's political situation was foreshadowing new storms. An agrarian reform of this magnitude, which changed the social and economic structure of the country, would bring its response. The reaction of the landowners, the industrialists, the traditional and foreign bourgeoisie, and the United Fruit Company was not long in coming, and they started a counter-revolution. The first step taken by these groups was to sabotage and obstruct the expropriation of many lands that remained unproductive. Secondly, the industrial and financial groups began to withhold all the investments they were making in Guatemala. And to this were added the natural administrative and bureaucratic obstacles, as well as the traditional racial conflicts between the indigenous peasants and the Creole landowners, and also a lack of action from the government itself, even though it had the means to solve these problems. The conspiracy reaches its peak when the United Fruit Company, together with President Eisenhower and the CIA, decide in 1954 to finally carry out Operation PB Success, whose ultimate goal was to overthrow the government of Jacobo Arbenz under the pretext that he was a supposed communist serving Soviet interests, although history would later show otherwise. Eisenhower, the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, and the head of the CIA, besides representing imperial geopolitics and American capital, personally held shares in the United Fruit Company. The CIA intensifies unrest within Guatemala alongside its internal allies. And in 1954, they launched a media operation, setting up a radio station that constantly labeled Árbenz as a red, a communist, and a Soviet. It urges Guatemalan crowds not to be ruled by a tyrannical communist government. During this media operation, armed subversion in Guatemala was openly encouraged. In addition, the CIA brings in a small invading army and moves 30 planes to airstrips in Honduras, Nicaragua, and the Panama Canal Zone. The Fruit Company and Guatemala's internal forces, aligned with the North, also help incite the masses against Árbenz. There were also elements of the army and the Guatemalan political class who worked in concert with the Anglo-Americans. After this, at 8 o'clock in the evening on June 18, 1954, the coup leader, Colonel Castillo, allied with the CIA, entered Guatemalan territory from Honduras with a relatively small number of men. In fact, Castillo and the CIA's invasion was more psychological than military. CIA planes flew over the capital, dropping leaflets announcing the arrival of the Liberation Army. They also dropped explosives and bricks over popular areas to spread panic among the population. In rural areas, several bombings were carried out against towns and villages in the interior. At the same time, they spread false news about the supposed progress of Castillo's troops and the defeats of the National Army. Even for Arbenz's government, it was very difficult to know what was really happening, since several groups trained by the United States were in charge of cutting important cables to interfere with government radios and communication methods. From start to finish, it was all a big psychological operation that made a handful of men look bigger than an entire government. Many claim that Arbenz had the ability to counter this coup, but the president knew that beyond this particular situation, the American capital and powers that opposed him would keep orchestrating new ways to overthrow him until they succeeded, not ruling out a possible military invasion. So, aware of his unfavorable position, unexpectedly, Jacobo Arbenz resigned from his historic presidency on June 23, 1954.
We all know how they have bombed and killed.
The citizens, right?
Not only the citizens, but also
The
citizens. We all know about the feat aimed at assassinating the representatives
of the
peasants and of the peasants in the towns they have occupied. especially in Bananera, where they carried out a punitive expedition against the representatives of the workers. Was what happened in Bananera an act of revenge by the fruit company? We have been outraged by the cowardly attacks of the North American mercenary pilots, knowing that Guatemala does not have an adequate air force to repel them. They have tried to sow panic throughout the country. They have strafed and bombed the armed forces fighting in the east of the Republic, hindering their operations. Perhaps many think that I am making a mistake. Deep in my conscience, I don't think so. Only a later historical judgment will be able to determine that. I wish for the popular achievements of October to be maintained and for peace to be restored once the invaders have been expelled from the country, and for the administration of the government that is being organized to be successful.
Colonel
Carlos XVI. With the satisfaction of someone who believes he has fulfilled his duty with faith in the future. I say, long live the October Revolution, long live Guatemala.
Jacobo Arbenz would only return to Guatemala once more, but after many years. The 1954 coup d'etat in Guatemala not only affected the future of so many Guatemalan peasants and workers, but also that of its president, Jacobo Arbenz. Throughout his exile, he was the victim of countless humiliations, slanders, and mockery. This was the result of the smear campaign that the United States powers systematically launched as soon as he resigned from the presidency. In Guatemala, he was omitted from history books, movies, and television. And if he was mentioned publicly, it was to subject him to the scorn of the media. Árbenz also experiences mental and physical decline on a personal level. They had stripped him of his homeland. They had taken away the opportunity for a better future for Guatemala. He had been humiliated and persecuted everywhere he went, and even his most precious love had turned away from him. Maria Cristina, his wife, had left as she couldn't endure her husband's challenging circumstances. From 1954 to 1971, the Colonel of Primavera and the People's Soldier keeps changing his residence. Arbenz and his family go through France, Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union, China, Uruguay, which shows solidarity with the family, and Venezuela, which offers him a university professorship. In Cuba, Fidel Castro, victorious in the revolution, invites him. But it is this same Castro who humiliates him in public statements while he was on the island and makes him leave it. In 1960, by 1965, his young daughter, Arabella Arbenz Villanova, dies as a result of substance abuse and a disordered, passionate life. He attends Arabella's funeral in Mexico before resuming his globetrotting life. Until in 1970, he was allowed to live in Mexico, as he was no longer considered a political threat. By the time of his death, from the glorious Árbenz of the October Revolution and the Agrarian Reform, all that was left was a 58-year-old man in an advanced state of old age, a result of alcoholism and the severe depression that struck him after his overthrow. He smoked a lot, was very thin, and had a head full of gray hair. Jacobo Arbenz Guzman died in complete solitude in Mexico on January 27, 1971, as a result of a heart attack. Nevertheless, and despite the loss of such a profound martyr of Guatemala, Arbenz manages to return to his country once again. On October 19, 1995, the procedures for his exhumation took place. The remains of Arbenz are received by the Guatemalan Air Force and taken to the National Palace. He is carried and received with honors by the country's authorities, his widow Maria Cristina, and a massive gathering of people. It could be said that he was mourned in the presence of his three great loves, the people, his wife, and his Guatemala, who did not hesitate to receive for the last time the greatest of her sons with the highest of inspirations, the future of the Guatemalan countryside. Thank you all very much for watching this video. I hope you liked it, and I invite you once again to support us by giving it a like, leaving your comments, sharing it on all your social networks, following us on our Instagram called La Nueva Enciclopedia, and collaborating on our Patreon, which you can find below. Thank you again, and may God bless you.